Hello, my name is Lisa Pfadenhauer. I'm a senior researcher based at the University of Munich in Germany. And today I will talk to you about three very important concepts, at least to my opinion, which everybody should be able to link when thinking about scaling up interventions. And these are context complexity and how this affects a scale-up project. This means today I'll be talking about context as a dynamic evolving system of interactions, which is much more than a list of determinants. Also, I will be talking about a challenge that I think all of us researchers that have been working in implementation science have encountered various times, which is defining the boundaries between an intervention, the way it's been implemented, and the context that surrounds this effort. Also, I will present you some principles, concepts, and ideas of how we as researchers can approach context when thinking about a scale-up project. So what is context? And I think considering the fact that we're using the term a lot, not only in the research life, but also in our daily life, it's quite interesting that while it's been widely used, it's heavily understudied and also oftentimes misunderstood, in particular in the health sciences. And this has various reasons, such as the health sciences being predominantly influenced by a positivist paradigm, where the way we think about context is often quite reductionist. And actually, a lot of the methods that we're using and promoting strip off context in order to produce valid results. Such as RCTs, were actually trying to control for context. Over the past decade, there's been an increasing attention towards the concept of context, in particular in the implementation sciences, where it's been considered a wicked problem that is there and that has to be addressed. However, the way it's been dealt with, I think there's a lot still to do when thinking about assessing or analyzing context. And this is also reflected by the third point I would like to make. The way context is defined in the health sciences, but also in implementation sciences. If you look at definitions, and I'll present some to you in a minute, these definitions, they vary widely and they capture various aspects. They account for different things. And this is the reason why context is considered a partially mature concept in the implementation sciences. However, and I think this is a really nice fact, is that context is considered in numerous implementation science theories, models, and frameworks, which I think demonstrates its importance. Just to show you some of the most widely cited implementation science theories, models, or frameworks. So we have the Paris framework, the EPIS framework, Cypher, or the theoretical domains framework. And you can see that context is captured somehow in all of these. For example, in Cypher, Laura Darmschroeder comes up with the differentiation between inner and outer setting, describing differences when it comes to looking at interventions that are implemented within organizational boundaries, for example. Then we have the Paris framework by Rycroft Malone, where context is considered a accumulation of culture, values, leadership, and evaluation that interacts with evidence of what is implemented and facilitation, and this interacts towards the implementation effort. Then we have the EPIS framework, where Ahrens kind of differentiates between also the inner and the outer context, reflecting on also differentiation made by Laura Darmschroeder in Cypher. And also we have the theoretical domains framework, which looks at behavior and behavior change, where context is expressed, for example, in opportunity, environmental context, and resources and social influences that definitely affects the way behavior shows. Also, in the way context is defined, it's treated quite differently. In 2006, Alison Kitson describes or defines context as setting or environment, which emerged more and more as synonyms for context, and potentially there are boundaries between context, setting, and environment. Graham Moore, who developed the Medical Research Council process evaluation guideline, puts it quite simply, saying that context includes anything external to the intervention. Again, you can see it that there's a boundary issue being brought forward. Carl May, in his paper from 2016, says that context are the normal conditions of practice that shape a healthcare team's capacity to implement change. So normal conditions, which I think is an interesting way to frame it. And Rogers comes up with a much more complex definition, saying that context is a multidimensional construct encompassing micro, meso, and macro level determinants, also a very important term that you'll encounter oftentimes when talking about context, that are pre-existing. So you're introducing something into historical context. There are things which are already there and which definitely will shape the way your intervention will show its effects and how you also will scale up this intervention. It's considered as dynamic and emergent throughout the implementation process. So continuously there's something going on and something changing, which highlights the temporal aspect of context, which is not a static construct. In 2015, my team in Munich and we conducted a concept analysis, analyzing pre-existing definitions of context, and came up with an quite comprehensive definition of context, saying that encompassing a range of characteristics and circumstances, including active and distinct aspects, rather than serving as passive backdrop. Context interacts with, shapes, and can either facilitate or constrain both the intervention and also its implementation. It does not only comprise physical location, but also roles, interactions, and relationships. And this is also important at multiple levels and reflects to the definition put forward by Rogers. So you can see that the way context is defined, it diverges. So there are multiple ways of how context is defined. And at the moment, there are discussions ongoing where people argue whether or not it actually would make sense to have a common definition of context, because potentially context is or needs to be defined very much depending on the project you're looking at, the intervention you're looking at, and the implementation effort you're looking at. So I think there's something happening here, so watch the space. But I think summarizing, you can say that there are current shortcomings in the concept in TMFs and how context is reflected and conceptualized there. So you could say that there's a lack of conceptual clarity and limited empirical research on context. Methods often oversimplify the context due to positivist paradigms. So methods such as RCTs are not really adequate to assess the complexities of context, and they often strip them off. There are challenges in assessing context, which reflects to the previous point. So there's a real dearth of tools, frameworks, and resources available to assess context. And also one factor which comes into play here is that oftentimes we have researchers have to make pragmatic decisions when trying to approach context, because unfortunately resources are usually limited. What can also be said is that in the implementation sciences, for a long time, there has been a strong focus on the micro and meso level, which is potentially due to the fact that a lot of the implementation science theories, models, and frameworks are heavily influenced by disciplines where interventions are usually implemented within an organizational setting. And in public health, for example, where we mostly work at the LMU in Munich, we have a lot of interventions which are not implemented on a micro or a meso level. So oftentimes we are, for example, looking at interventions such as sugar-sweetened beverage taxation or sugar taxes in general, which are implemented on a macro level, which is why we are usually kind of forced to look beyond certain meso and micro level factors, because we have to consider whole systems when looking at why certain things like sugar taxes work in one context and fail potentially in other contexts. Also, which I think is an important takeaway, is that the way context has been defined and conceptualized and is usually also operationalized in research is that the way we approach it, context is usually considered a fixed rather than a dynamic and complex construct. And this also, of course, then can be traced back to the lack of methods, tools, resources available to approach context, because capturing dynamic aspects is challenging or can be challenging. It's not impossible, but it's challenging. Also, one of the shortcomings that I think I hope I made clear to you is that there is a challenge in defining boundaries between context, interventions, and the way they are implemented, talking about blurred lines. So sometimes there are no clear edges between context, intervention, implementation strategies. This means that, context is continuously changing. There are emerging things happening. The intervention is adapted to address these emerging phenomena. It's adapted and tailored towards changing needs. And it becomes also increasingly embedded in the context it's been implemented. So it becomes kind of naturalized and becomes more and more context. And at some point, and that's, I think, also the goal of implementing intervention, in order to make it sustainable, it has to be embedded, right? And then also implementation strategies that actively change the context and react to changes in context. Sometimes they are kind of an emerging characteristic of the system, that these implementation strategies become more and more like emerging characteristics of the respective context. And all of this, of course, is then also interacting, which makes it even more challenging. Increasingly, researchers have been considering thinking from complexity science and system thinking into the way they conceptualize context. It kind of adds to making boundaries potentially more blurry, but it also helps to account for the complexity which is necessary in order to fully understand why certain implementation failures fail and others succeed. And what both of these sciences and ways of thinking can add is that they allow you and endow you with methods and also resources to assess structures, relationships, and interdependencies among components within a system in order to understand and predict the behavior within the systems. And this has certain aspects that can be captured, such as interconnectedness, holism, feedback loops, nonlinearity, emergence, adaptation, or self-organization. And we try to capture this in the context and implementation framework, which we developed in 2017, where we kind of try to account for all of this by implementing 3 dimensions: context, implementation, and the intervention. We came up with defining a boundary between the setting and the context, saying that the setting is where actually the intervention meets its recipients, and context, everything being outside of this particular setting. Then we have the implementation effort and the intervention that comes into play. And context is structured into 8 domains: the geographical, epidemiological, social-cultural, socio-economic, ethical, legal, and political domain that exerts its influence on various levels, the macro, the meso, and the micro level, which you can see by the shading. You have the intervention, which is put into practice by an implementation process being undertaken by implementation agents, which enforce or are being targeted by implementation strategies. And all of this leads to an intervention being implemented within a certain setting. Of course, also here, interactions and interdependencies between the different components of the system. Often what happens is that we're not implementing interventions into a vacuum. So sometimes there are other independent interventions which you also need to consider when looking at a system into which an intervention is implemented. I brought you 5 recommendations of how you could consider these aspects when thinking about your scale-up project. I'll start by the first aspect, which is define your context. Why? I think it's very important within a project to have a common definition of context in order to be aware that you're talking about the same things. You can talk about what levels of context are actually relevant in your specific case, what relevant domains are to your interventions, and what relevance component are to your intervention. You can use existing definitions, but you can also come up with your own working definition if none of the existing definitions really does justice to your cause. And you can do so by brainstorming, consulting literature, or engaging stakeholders. Then I would advise you to select your TMFs. So in order to ensure that your scale-up is theory-informed, I would strongly encourage you to select one or multiple TMFs that facilitate the assessment and analysis of all relevant aspects to your scale-up, and potentially integrate multiple TMFs, for example, a behavior change TMF or a macro-level TMF, in order to fully account for the complexity. And you can do so by systematically searching literature for TMFs, but also integrating stakeholders into the selection process. Then I would advise you to identify interdependencies by using complexity science and system thinking to identify interdependencies within the context. Thus, you can ensure sustainability and effective and equitable scale-up, avoiding unintended consequences. And one way of doing so is stakeholder mapping, analysis, system mapping, policy analysis, and so forth. I would also then, for pragmatic reasons and resource restriction reasons, advise you to prioritize the context factors that you'll be assessing in detail, because this is just how reality affects the way we're doing research. And thus you can ensure that that your intervention and your scale-up remains relevant, feasible, and acceptable. You can do so by employing framework analysis, environmental scans, and ideally also, of course, engaging stakeholders. I would also advise you to set up your scale-up project as an adaptive scale-up project in order to account for complex, dynamic, and unpredictable systems that require adaptations. I would also advise you conceptualize your scale-up as an adaptive process responding to phenomena such as emergence and nonlinearity. And you can do so by implementing mechanisms such as interactive learning cycles or participatory action research in order to account for emerging phenomena that you have to account for when being adaptive. And also, of course, to implement some form of monitoring in order to spot changes within the system that you have to react to. And then, and I think this is pointing to one of the next modules that you will also be going through, engage stakeholders throughout the entire process, I think is always valuable. I pointed to that towards the previous recommendations, but I think this cannot be stressed enough. And ideally, you would employ a formal stakeholder engagement strategy in order to fully integrate stakeholders into your scale-up project. So my key messages are that there are no definite definitions and boundaries to context, which requires researchers to find their own way of approaching and defining context. When defining, assessing, and analyzing context, research should conceptualize context as a complex system that has properties such as being dynamic, emerging, and adaptive. And with a lack of concise definitions and boundaries in scale-up projects, researchers are advised to carefully define context, select appropriate frameworks, identify interdependencies, prioritize factors, plan adaptively, and engage stakeholders throughout your scale-up. These are my references, and I would like to thank you for your attention. And I wish you a lot of fun and a lot of enlightening moments by going through the other modules. Thank you very much.